Imagine for a moment that you've just woken up in Salem, Massachusetts, in the year 1692. The air around you feels thick with more than just the morning mist rolling in from the harbor. There's something else hanging heavy in the atmosphere, something that makes your neighbors glance sideways at each other with suspicion and fear. You might think you understand what it was like to be accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. But trust me, the reality was far more terrifying and complex than any Hollywood portrayal could capture. If you're finding value in these deep dives into history's darkest chapters, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more that you know, and it tells me you want to explore more of these untold stories together. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. There's something powerful about our community connecting through these shared journeys into the past. Now settle in, maybe dim the lights, and let's step into the shoes of someone who lived through one of the most paranoid and dangerous periods in American history. We're going to explore what life was truly like for a woman accused of witchcraft in Salem, and why surviving even a single day under suspicion would test every ounce of courage and cunning you possess. Congratulations, you've just been whispered about in the village square. Someone has suggested, perhaps in hushed tones after Sunday service, that your recent string of bad luck, your neighbor's sick cow, or the way you looked at Goodman Proctor last Tuesday might be signs of something far more sinister. In Salem, 1692, being suspected of witchcraft didn't require evidence in any sense we'd recognize today. It required only the wrong person saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. The first thing you need to understand is that Salem in 1692 wasn't the quaint New England village you might imagine. This was a community of roughly 2,000 people living under crushing psychological pressure. The colony had been without a charter for years, creating legal uncertainty that left everyone feeling vulnerable. King William's War was raging on the frontier, with French and Native American raids terrorizing outlying settlements. Refugees streamed into Salem Village, straining resources and heightening tensions between neighbors who were already struggling to survive. The winter of 1691 to 1692 had been particularly brutal. Food stores were running low, and many families faced the very real possibility of starvation before spring crops could be harvested. In a Puritan community where every misfortune was seen as either God's punishment for sin or the devil's interference, these hardships created a perfect storm of fear and suspicion. Your daily life as a woman in Salem was already constrained by expectations that would seem suffocating today. You were expected to be quiet, obedient, and deferential to male authority. Your legal rights were virtually non-existent. If you were married, you couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even have custody of your own children. If you were unmarried, you lived under the authority of your father or male relatives. Any deviation from expected behavior, any sign of independence or unusual knowledge, could mark you as suspicious. The Puritan worldview that dominated Salem saw the devil as a constant, active presence in daily life. Unlike modern religious thinking that might view evil as abstract, Salem residents believed Satan literally walked among them, recruiting human agents to do his bidding. Witches weren't just folklore, they were understood to be real people who had made actual pacts with the devil in exchange for supernatural powers to harm their neighbors. What made someone suspect? The criteria were terrifyingly broad and subjective. If you were too poor, you might be seen as desperate enough to turn to Satan for help. If you were too prosperous, you might be suspected of using dark magic to gain unfair advantage. If you were argumentative or stood up for yourself, you displayed unwomanly behavior that suggested demonic influence. If you were too quiet and kept to yourself, you were clearly hiding something sinister. Knowledge that would be considered normal today could mark you as a witch in 1692. If you knew herbal remedies for common ailments, you practiced folk medicine that some viewed as suspiciously close to witchcraft. If you could read, especially if you read anything other than the Bible, you had access to potentially dangerous knowledge. If you were skilled at predicting weather or understanding natural phenomena, you demonstrated powers that seemed supernatural to your neighbors. Your relationships with other women were particularly fraught with danger. Female friendships could be viewed with suspicion, especially if they involved sharing knowledge about healing, midwifery, or household management. Women who supported each other too openly risked being seen as part of a coven. Yet isolation was equally dangerous, as women without strong community ties had fewer people to defend them when accusations arose. The economic tensions in Salem added another layer of danger to daily life. Many of the accusations followed predictable patterns of social and economic conflict. Property disputes, unpaid debts, and competition for resources created resentments that could easily transform into witchcraft accusations. If your family had recently acquired land, especially land that neighbors coveted, you became a target. If you owed money you couldn't repay, creditors might find witchcraft accusations a convenient way to seize your property. The legal system offered no protection against these accusations. In fact, it actively encouraged them. The court accepted spectral evidence, testimony that the accused person's spirit had appeared to and tormented the witness, even while the accused was physically elsewhere. This meant that anyone could accuse anyone else of witchcraft simply by claiming to have seen their specter causing harm. No alibi could protect you from spectral evidence. The physical examinations conducted on accused witches were humiliating and invasive. Court officials searched your body for devil's marks, unusual moles, scars, or blemishes that supposedly showed where Satan had touched you. They looked for witches' teats, extra nipples where familiars supposedly suckled. These examinations were conducted by groups of women appointed by the court, but the process stripped away any remaining dignity or privacy. Sleep became your enemy during this period of suspicion. Puritan theology taught that the devil was most active at night, and many of the accusers claimed to be tormented by specters during nighttime hours. If you tossed and turned from anxiety, if you talked in your sleep, or if you sleepwalked, these could all be interpreted as evidence of supernatural activity. Some accused witches reported being afraid to sleep, knowing that anything they did unconsciously might be twisted into evidence against them. Your children became both your greatest vulnerability and your potential salvation. Children's testimony was given special weight in witchcraft cases, as their innocence was thought to make them particularly sensitive to supernatural influences. If your own children turned against you, as happened in several Salem cases, your situation became nearly hopeless. Yet children who steadfastly defended their mothers sometimes helped save them from execution. The community dynamics that had once provided support and security now became sources of mortal danger. Church attendance, previously a routine part of weekly life, transformed into a terrifying ordeal where every word, every gesture, every expression was scrutinized for signs of guilt or innocence. Communion became particularly fraught, as the accusers often claimed to suffer fits when supposed witches participated in religious ceremonies. Prayer itself became suspect if you were accused. The inability to recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly was considered evidence of witchcraft, as the devil supposedly prevented his servants from speaking holy words correctly. The pressure of being watched and judged while attempting to pray often caused people to stumble over familiar words, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that confirmed suspicions. Your household management, once a source of pride and competence, now carried hidden dangers. If your bread rose too well, if your butter churned too easily, if your garden produced unusually good crops, these successes might be attributed to supernatural assistance. Conversely, if you experienced normal household failures, the spoiled milk or failed crops of your neighbors might be blamed on your malevolent magic. The weathers became your constant companion in worry. Unusual storms, droughts, or other natural phenomena were often blamed on witches. And if you had recently argued with someone who suffered weather-related losses, you might find yourself accused of causing their misfortune through supernatural means. Even commenting on the weather could be dangerous, as predictions that proved accurate might be seen as evidence of unnatural knowledge. Your medical knowledge, essential for caring for your family in an era without professional health care, transformed into potential evidence against you. If you successfully treated someone's illness with herbs or folk remedies, you might be suspected of using magic. If your treatment failed, you might be accused of deliberately harming the patient. If you refused to treat someone, perhaps because you lacked the necessary herbs or knowledge, that refusal could be interpreted as evidence of malevolent intent. The social gatherings that had once brought joy and community connection became minefields of potential accusations. Quilting bees, barn raisings, and other communal activities continued during the witch trials, but the atmosphere was poisoned by suspicion. Conversations that had once flowed freely became guarded and careful. Laughter died away as people worried that expressions of joy might be misinterpreted as celebration of evil deeds. Your interactions with animals carried new dangers during this period of hysteria. Cats, in particular, were viewed with deep suspicion as potential familiars. If you owned a cat, especially a black one, you risked being seen as having a demonic companion. If stray animals seemed drawn to your property, or if you showed unusual skill with livestock, these could be interpreted as signs of supernatural influence over the animal kingdom. The very herbs and plants you used for cooking and medicine became potential evidence of witchcraft. Certain plants were associated with folk magic and popular imagination, and possessing them could be dangerous. Even common kitchen herbs might be viewed suspiciously if you used them in ways that seemed too knowledgeable or effective. Your grandmother's recipes, passed down through generations of women, suddenly carried the potential for death sentences. Dreams and nighttime experiences took on terrifying significance during the Salem witch trials. If you reported having vivid dreams, especially ones involving conflict or supernatural elements, These could be interpreted as evidence of nocturnal journeys to witch meetings. If you claimed not to dream at all, skeptics might suspect you were hiding supernatural experiences. Even innocent dreams about deceased relatives or biblical figures could be twisted into evidence of communication with spirits. Your religious devotion, once a source of comfort and community standing, became a careful performance where every word and gesture was scrutinized. If you were too fervent in your prayers, you might be suspected of overcompensating for secret sins. If you seemed insufficiently moved by sermons about witchcraft, your lack of reaction could be interpreted as guilt. If you showed too much emotion when others were accused, you might be suspected of sympathizing with Satan's servants. The physical symptoms of stress and fear that naturally arose from living under constant suspicion could themselves become evidence against you. If you lost weight from anxiety and poor appetite, your gaunt appearance might be seen as evidence of demonic transformation. If you gained weight, perhaps from stress eating or lack of physical activity due to social isolation, this too could be viewed suspiciously. Trembling hands, nervous tics, or stammering speech, all natural responses to terror, were sometimes interpreted as signs of supernatural influence. Your work, whether in the home, the fields, or the marketplace, carried new layers of danger. If you were too successful in your endeavors, supernatural assistance might be suspected. If you were unsuccessful, deliberate sabotage through witchcraft might be blamed on you. If you changed your work patterns, perhaps trying to avoid situations where you might be observed and misinterpreted, this behavioral change itself could be seen as evidence of guilt. The bonds of marriage, meant to provide security and partnership, became strained under the pressure of accusation. Husbands were expected to control their wives, and a woman's suspected witchcraft reflected poorly on her husband's spiritual authority. Some husbands stood by their accused wives, but others abandoned them to save themselves and their remaining family members. The fear of guilt by association was very real, as entire families could be destroyed by accusations against one member. Your clothing and appearance, once matters of personal preference within Puritan constraints, became subjects of intense scrutiny. Dressing too well might suggest supernatural assistance in acquiring fine things. Dressing too poorly might indicate the degradation that came with serving Satan. Any unusual fashion choices, bright colors in a community that favored dark clothing, or garments that seemed inappropriate for your social station could attract unwanted attention. The books you owned, if you were fortunate enough to be literate and possess any, represented potential evidence against you. While the Bible was expected in every household, other books might be viewed with suspicion. Books about medicine, astronomy, or natural philosophy could be seen as containing dangerous knowledge. Even innocent books of poetry or history might be interpreted as evidence of unnatural learning for a woman. As evening falls on another day of living under suspicion, in Salem, you realize that surviving as an accused witch required more than innocence. It demanded a careful performance of perfect Puritan womanhood while managing the terror of knowing that any word, any action, any expression could be your last. The weight of constant surveillance, the fear of betrayal by neighbors and even family members, and the knowledge that the legal system offered no real protection created a psychological pressure that broke many before they ever reached trial. The darkness that settles over Salem is more than the absence of light. It's the shadow of a community that has turned against itself, where the very bonds of trust and mutual support that made survival possible in harsh colonial conditions have been poisoned by fear and suspicion. Tomorrow will bring new dangers, new opportunities for misinterpretation, new reasons to fear that your neighbors might decide you've made a pact with the devil. In this world of shadows and whispers, survival depends not on innocence, but on invisibility. The best hope for an accused witch in Salem was to somehow become so unremarkable, so perfectly ordinary, that the terrible attention of the community would move on to someone else. But even that strategy carried its own risks, as too much effort to appear normal could itself seem suspicious to neighbors primed to see guilt in every action. The Salem witch trials remind us that rational thought and legal protections we take for granted can disappear with terrifying speed when fear takes hold of a community. For the women who lived through this nightmare, every sunrise brought not hope, but another day of walking a tightrope over an abyss of suspicion where a single misstep could mean death. Now that you understand the social landscape and daily dangers that defined Salem's witch trial period, let's examine what happened when an accusation was actually made. The moment someone pointed a finger and whispered the word witch, a terrifying machinery of investigation and judgment began to turn, and very few who became caught in its gears ever escaped unscathed. The process typically began with what seemed like innocent community gossip. Perhaps a child fell ill after visiting a particular woman's home. Maybe crops failed after a disagreement with a neighbor, or someone reported strange dreams after encountering a person already viewed with suspicion. These initial whispers would spread through Salem's tight-knit community like wildfire, growing more dramatic and damning with each retelling. What made these accusations so insidious was their complete subjectivity. There was no objective standard for what constituted witchcraft. The mere suggestion that someone might be practicing the dark arts was often enough to trigger a formal investigation. And once that investigation began, the accused found themselves trapped in a system specifically designed to extract confessions rather than determine innocence. The legal proceedings that followed were unlike anything we would recognize as justice today. The court operated under the assumption that the devil was actively working through witches to destroy the godly community of Salem. This wasn't seen as a criminal matter in the traditional sense, but as a spiritual war requiring extraordinary measures to protect the faithful. When formal charges were brought, the accused would be arrested and held in the Salem jail, a cramped, filthy facility where prisoners were chained to the walls and forced to pay for their own food and bedding. Many spent months in these deplorable conditions while awaiting trial, with some dying from illness and neglect before they ever saw the inside of a courtroom. The trial itself was a spectacle that drew crowds from throughout the region. The accused would be brought before a panel of judges who were already convinced of the reality of witchcraft and the likelihood of the defendant's guilt. These men, including figures like William Stoughton and Samuel Sewall, saw themselves as warriors in God's army, fighting against Satan's influence in their community. The evidence presented against the accused would seem laughable by modern standards if it weren't so tragically deadly. Spectral evidence was not only admissible, but often formed the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Witnesses would testify that the accused person's spirit had visited them in dreams or visions, tormenting them or trying to force them to sign the devil's book. The fact that the accused person might have been miles away at the time was considered irrelevant, since everyone knew that witches could project their spirits across great distances. Physical evidence was equally absurd. Examiners would search the accused for witches' marks, any unusual mole, birthmark, or blemish that could be interpreted as a spot where the devil had touched them or where they had nursed their familiar spirits. A small scar from childhood could become proof of demonic covenant. An unusual birthmark could seal someone's fate. The infamous touch test was another cornerstone of Salem's twisted justice system. Afflicted accusers would writhe and scream in apparent agony during court proceedings, claiming that the defendant's evil spirit was tormenting them. But when the accused was forced to touch the afflicted person, the symptoms would miraculously cease. This was taken as definitive proof that the accused was indeed a witch, since only the witch's touch could stop the torment they were causing. Even more disturbing were the forced physical examinations conducted on accused women. Court-appointed examiners would strip the accused naked and search every inch of their bodies for signs of witchcraft. They looked for unusual marks, extra nipples where familiars might nurse, or any other physical abnormality that could be twisted into evidence of supernatural activity. These examinations were conducted in front of male judges and officials, adding sexual humiliation to the already overwhelming trauma of accusation. The psychological pressure applied to extract confessions was relentless and sophisticated. Accused individuals were told repeatedly that confession was their only path to salvation, both spiritual and temporal. Those who confessed and named others as fellow witches were often spared execution, while those who maintained their innocence faced almost certain death. This created a perverse incentive structure that encouraged false confessions and the naming of additional victims. The interrogation techniques employed would be recognized today as psychological torture. Suspects were questioned for hours or even days without rest, badgered with leading questions, and subjected to verbal abuse designed to break down their resistance. They were told that God would forgive them if they confessed, but that continued denial would damn their souls for eternity. For deeply religious people who genuinely feared for their salvation, this spiritual blackmail was often more effective than physical torture. Children were particularly vulnerable to these pressure tactics. Young accusers like Abigail Williams and Mercy Lewis became the star witnesses in trial after trial, their dramatic performances in the courtroom providing the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. These children, some as young as 9 years old, wielded the power of life and death over adults in their community, describing elaborate scenes of witches' meetings and demonic ceremonies with disturbing detail. What made their testimony so compelling to the judges and jury was its apparent consistency. The afflicted children would describe similar visions of the accused witches attending supernatural gatherings in the woods, signing the devil's book, and participating in blasphemous ceremonies. Of course, we now understand that this consistency likely resulted from the children feeding off each other's stories, unconsciously coordinating their accounts through repeated tellings and shared cultural expectations about what witches were supposed to do. The most tragic aspect of these proceedings was how they tore apart the fabric of Salem's community. Family members were forced to testify against each other. Neighbors who had lived peacefully side by side for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of life and death accusations. Children turned against parents, spouses against each other, and lifelong friends became bitter enemies. The case of Martha Corey illustrates how even the most unlikely suspects could be swept up in the hysteria. Corey was a church member known for her piety and skepticism about the witch trials themselves. When she expressed doubt about the validity of the accusations, she quickly found herself accused of witchcraft. Her husband, Giles Corey, initially supported the proceedings until his own wife was accused, at which point he began to speak out against the trials and was himself charged with witchcraft. Giles Corey's fate became one of the most horrific examples of Salem's perverted justice. When he refused to enter a plea, thereby preventing a trial that would allow the authorities to seize his property if he were convicted, he was subjected to pressing, an archaic form of execution where heavy stones were placed on his chest until he either agreed to plead or died. For 2 days, the elderly man lay in a field with increasing weight piled upon him, his only recorded words being "more weight" when asked to confess. He died without entering a plea, preserving his property for his heirs, but paying with his life for his defiance. The execution of those convicted of witchcraft was designed to serve as both punishment and public spectacle. The condemned were taken to Gallows Hill, where a crowd would gather to witness what was seen as justice being served against Satan's agents. The accused were given one final opportunity to confess and save their souls, with ministers delivering lengthy sermons about repentance and divine judgment. Those who maintained their innocence to the end often became the most powerful symbols of the trial's injustice. Rebecca Nurse, a respected church member and mother of 8, protested her innocence even as the noose was placed around her neck. Her dignity in the face of death began to turn public opinion against the trials, as many community members found it impossible to believe that such a godly woman could be in league with the devil. The methods used to determine guilt were so arbitrary and subjective that they revealed the fundamental flaw in the entire enterprise. The same evidence that condemned one person might be dismissed when applied to someone else, depending on their social status, family connections, or relationship to the accusers. Wealthy merchants and prominent ministers found their accusations quietly dropped, while poor women and social outcasts faced the full fury of Salem's witch-hunting apparatus. Perhaps most disturbing was how the legal system abandoned its own precedents and protections in pursuit of witches. Traditional requirements for evidence were suspended. The testimony of children, normally inadmissible in court, became the foundation of capital cases. Hearsay evidence, dreams, and visions were treated as fact. The presumption of innocence was replaced by the assumption that accusations must have some basis in truth, since who would make such serious charges lightly? The psychological impact on the accused was devastating, even for those who ultimately survived. Being charged with witchcraft meant facing not just the possibility of execution, but the complete destruction of one's reputation, family relationships, and place in the community. Even those who were eventually released often found themselves permanently marked by suspicion, unable to return to their former lives. The financial cost of accusation was equally ruinous. Prisoners were required to pay for their own food, bedding, and even the chains that bound them. Families bankrupted themselves, trying to keep accused relatives alive during their imprisonment. Legal fees, bribes to guards, and the cost of maintaining households while breadwinners were imprisoned pushed many families into poverty from which they never recovered. Meanwhile, the accusers found themselves wielding unprecedented power in their community. Young women who had previously been expected to remain silent and obedient suddenly discovered that their words could determine who lived and died. Some historians have suggested that this reversal of normal power dynamics may have been part of the appeal of participating in the accusations, offering a brief taste of agency to those normally denied any voice in their community's affairs. The trials created their own momentum, with each conviction seeming to validate the entire enterprise and making it harder for anyone to question the process without seeming to defend witchcraft itself. Those who expressed skepticism found themselves suspected of being witch sympathizers, or even witches themselves. This created a climate where rational discussion became impossible, and fear drove the community toward ever more extreme measures. The role of social and economic tensions in shaping accusations became increasingly clear as the trials progressed. Disputes over land ownership, church membership, and political authority found expression through witchcraft charges. Accusers consistently targeted individuals from families or factions they were already in conflict with, using the witch trials as a weapon in ongoing community disputes. The Salem witch trials represented the complete breakdown of rational legal and social processes under the pressure of mass hysteria and religious extremism. What began as concerns about a few young women's strange behavior metastasized into a systematic persecution that consumed the community's ability to distinguish between truth and fantasy, justice and vengeance, protection and destruction. The machinery of accusation, once set in motion, proved almost impossible to stop, grinding forward until it had destroyed dozens of lives and left the entire community traumatized by its own capacity for cruelty disguised as righteousness. The methods used to identify and prosecute witches in Salem represented a complete breakdown of rational justice. When you were accused of witchcraft, you entered a legal system that had abandoned logic in favor of superstition and fear. The evidence that could condemn you would seem laughable by today's standards, yet it carried the weight of life and death in those terrifying months of 1692. The most chilling aspect of these trials was how easily anyone could become a suspect. You might think you were safe because you attended church regularly, kept to yourself, and followed all the social conventions of Puritan society. But safety was an illusion. The accusers, many of them young girls, experiencing what they claimed were supernatural torments, could point their fingers at anyone and set the machinery of persecution in motion. Once accused, you faced a series of examinations designed not to determine your innocence, but to extract a confession of guilt. The magistrates conducting these examinations approached each case with the assumption that the accused was guilty until proven otherwise. They weren't seeking truth. They were seeking confirmation of what they already believed. The questions weren't neutral inquiries, but leading interrogations designed to trap you in contradictions or admissions. The physical examinations were particularly degrading and pseudoscientific. Officials would strip you naked and search every inch of your body for what they called witch marks. These could be moles, birthmarks, scars, or any unusual skin feature. The logic was that the devil would mark his servants, leaving physical evidence of their supernatural allegiance. If you had a prominent mole, that was evidence. If you had unusually smooth skin, that too could be interpreted as supernatural. There was no way to win. Even more bizarre was the needle test. Officials would poke suspected witch marks with needles or pins. If you cried out in pain, it proved you were human and therefore possibly innocent. If you didn't react, either because the mark was naturally numb or because you were trying to endure the pain silently, it proved you were a witch whose devil-marked flesh couldn't feel pain. The test was designed so that any response could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. The spectral evidence was perhaps the most insidious form of proof accepted by the courts. Spectral evidence meant that if someone claimed to see your spirit or specter tormenting them, even while you were physically present elsewhere, this could be used as evidence of your guilt. The accusers would writhe in apparent agony, claiming your spirit was pinching, biting, or choking them. They would see your ghostly form flying through the air or commanding them to sign the devil's book. This created an impossible situation. How could you defend yourself against accusations of crimes your spirit supposedly committed while you were asleep in your bed or working in your fields? The magistrates reasons that the devil could only use your likeness with your permission, so if someone saw your specter causing harm, you must have given Satan permission to use your form. It was circular logic that made defense nearly impossible. The touch test added another layer of supposed supernatural evidence. If an afflicted person was having fits and you touched them, causing the fits to stop, this was considered proof of your guilt. The reasoning was that witches could withdraw their supernatural influence by touching their victims. But if you refused to touch the afflicted person, that too could be seen as evidence of guilt, as it suggested you knew your touch would reveal your supernatural powers. The court also accepted what they called maleficium, evidence of harmful magic affecting the community. If your neighbor's cow died after you argued with them, that could be evidence of witchcraft. If someone fell ill after refusing to lend you money, you might be accused of cursing them. If crops failed near your property, if milk soured, if children became sick after encountering you, all of these natural occurrences could be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural malevolence. Your behavior during the proceedings was scrutinized for signs of guilt or innocence. If you appeared calm and composed, this suggested an unnatural lack of concern that might indicate supernatural confidence. If you seemed nervous or distressed, this could be interpreted as evidence of guilt weighing on your conscience. If you prayed eloquently, some suspected you were trying too hard to appear pious. If you stumbled over prayers, this proved the devil was preventing you from speaking holy words. The confession process was particularly manipulative. Officials would tell you that confession was the path to salvation, that admitting your guilt would save your soul, even if it might cost your life. They would suggest that the devil had deceived you, that you might have signed his book without fully understanding what you were doing. They would offer scenarios where your guilt seemed understandable, even sympathetic. Many people, exhausted by interrogation and desperate to end their torment, did confess to witchcraft. But confession created its own trap. Once you admitted to being a witch, you were expected to name others who had participated in supernatural activities with you. You were asked to identify other witches you had seen at devil's meetings, other people who had signed Satan's book. Your confession became a tool to generate more accusations, spreading the net of suspicion ever wider. The social dynamics of accusation revealed the underlying tensions and conflicts within Salem's community. Many accusations followed lines of existing disputes over land, inheritance, church politics, or personal grudges. If you had been involved in property disputes, if you had challenged church authority, if you had quarreled with neighbors over boundaries or business dealings, these conflicts could resurface in the form of witchcraft accusations. Women were particularly vulnerable to accusations, especially those who didn't conform to expected social roles. Widows who inherited property, women who spoke too freely in public, those who practiced folk medicine or midwifery, women who had reputations for being argumentative or difficult, all faced elevated risk. The accusations often revealed deep anxieties about women's roles in Puritan society and fears about female autonomy. The legal proceedings themselves were stacked against the accused. The court operated under English law, which allowed for the death penalty for witchcraft, but the specific procedures developed in Salem were innovations that made conviction more likely. The judges, led by Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, were not trained lawyers, but magistrates who brought their own beliefs and prejudices to the proceedings. The lack of adequate legal representation meant that accused individuals had to defend themselves against charges they barely understood, using legal concepts they had never encountered. There were no defense attorneys arguing on your behalf, no one to object to improper evidence or leading questions. You stood alone against the combined authority of church and state, both convinced of your guilt before the proceedings began. The speed of the trials also worked against the accused. The court moved quickly through cases, processing accusations and reaching verdicts with little time for careful consideration of evidence. The pressure to clear the docket, combined with the assumption that supernatural forces were actively threatening the community, created an atmosphere where thorough investigation was seen as dangerous delay. The physical conditions of imprisonment while awaiting trial were themselves a form of torture. Accused individuals were chained in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Some died in jail before their trials, victims of disease, malnutrition, or despair. The psychological pressure of imprisonment, combined with the certainty that conviction meant death, broke down many people's resistance to confession. The financial burden of accusation was another weapon in the system's arsenal. Accused individuals had to pay for their own imprisonment, including the cost of food, chains, and even the services of the jailer. Families were bankrupted by these expenses, creating additional pressure to confess quickly and end the ordeal. The economic impact extended beyond individual families to the entire community, as productive members were removed from the workforce and their assets frozen. The testimony of children was given extraordinary weight in these proceedings. Young accusers, some as young as 9 years old, were treated as reliable witnesses whose word could condemn adults to death. The court seemed to believe that children's innocence made them more susceptible to supernatural influence but also more trustworthy in identifying supernatural threats. This created a situation where adult lives hung on the testimony of children who may have been influenced by suggestion, attention, or fear. The role of ministers and religious authorities in the proceedings added another layer of legitimacy to the accusations. When respected religious leaders supported the trials and validated the existence of supernatural threats, it became much harder for individuals to maintain their innocence. The fusion of religious and legal authority meant that challenging the proceedings was seen as challenging God Himself. The confession of some accused individuals created a domino effect that made denial seem less credible. If respected community members admitted to practicing witchcraft, it became harder for others to maintain their innocence. The confessions, often extracted under duress or motivated by the hope of avoiding execution, created a narrative that seemed to confirm the existence of a widespread supernatural conspiracy. The evidence of books and literacy could even be turned against the accused. If you owned books beyond the Bible, particularly if they dealt with subjects like medicine, astronomy, or natural philosophy, this could be seen as evidence of supernatural learning. The Puritan suspicion of knowledge that came from sources other than Scripture meant that intellectual curiosity itself could become grounds for suspicion. The examination of your social relationships provided another avenue for generating evidence. Officials would ask about your friendships, your business partnerships, your family connections. They would investigate your reputation in the community, looking for patterns of behavior that might indicate supernatural influence. If you had been successful in business, if your crops had prospered when others failed, if you had seemed to have unusual luck or insight, these positive outcomes could be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural assistance. The seasonal timing of the trials, beginning in the spring and escalating through the summer, created additional pressure. The agricultural calendar meant that key community members were being removed from essential work during crucial growing seasons. The economic disruption added to the general sense of crisis and urgency that drove the proceedings forward. The geographic pattern of accusations revealed the social fault lines within the community. Accusations tended to flow from Salem village toward Salem town, from poorer areas toward wealthier ones, from those with less political power toward those with more. The witchcraft trials became a vehicle for expressing and resolving social tensions that had been building for years. By the time the trials ended in late 1692, 20 people had been executed, 5 had died in prison, and over 150 had been imprisoned. The methods used to identify and prosecute witches had created a system where accusation was tantamount to conviction, where defense was nearly impossible, and where the normal protections of English law were abandoned in favor of procedures designed to confirm supernatural guilt. The legacy of these methods extended far beyond Salem. The trials became a cautionary tale about the dangers of abandoning rational legal procedures in favor of superstition and mass hysteria. They demonstrated how quickly a community could turn against its own members when fear overcame reason, and how legal systems could be corrupted by the very prejudices they were supposed to overcome. The witch trials of Salem stand as a stark reminder of what happens when society abandons the principles of evidence-based justice in favor of fear-driven persecution. The methods used to identify and prosecute witches weren't just flawed, they were designed to produce predetermined outcomes regardless of guilt or innocence. In this system, being accused was itself a form of guilt, and proving innocence was virtually impossible. The witch trials had established a terrifying precedent where accusations alone could destroy lives. But what happened next reveals an even darker truth about human nature under pressure. As the hysteria reached its peak in the summer of 1692, the very fabric of Salem society began to unravel in ways that would haunt the community for generations. By August, the jails were overflowing. Men, women, and children packed into cramped cells designed for far fewer prisoners. The conditions were deplorable beyond imagination. Stone walls wept with moisture, creating a perpetual dampness that seeped into clothing and bones. Straw scattered on floors became sodden with human waste, creating a stench so overpowering that visitors often vomited upon entering. Food was scarce and of the poorest quality. Prisoners received thin gruel once or twice daily, sometimes supplemented with moldy bread that families could afford to bring. Many lost dramatic amounts of weight, their bodies wasting away as they awaited trial or execution. The weak grew weaker, and several died in custody before ever facing formal charges. But the physical suffering paled in comparison to the psychological torment. Imagine spending months in near total darkness, listening to the constant sounds of weeping, praying, and occasionally screaming. Sleep was nearly impossible, with so many bodies crammed together, the colds and the ever-present fear of what tomorrow might bring. Some prisoners went mad from the stress, babbling incoherently or sitting in catatonic silence for hours. Children as young as 4 years old were imprisoned alongside adults. Dorothy Good, daughter of accused witch Sarah Good, spent months in chains so heavy she could barely move. The trauma inflicted on these young minds was irreversible. Many never fully recovered from their imprisonment, carrying the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The accused faced an impossible choice: confess to witchcraft and possibly live, or maintain innocence and likely die. This created one of the most perverse aspects of the entire ordeal. Those who confessed, even falsely, were often spared execution because their admissions validated the court's proceedings. They became valuable witnesses against others, feeding the machine of accusation and terror. Sarah Churchill, a servant girl who initially made accusations, later recanted under pressure from her conscience. She confessed that she had lied about seeing specters and practicing witchcraft. But when she attempted to tell the truth, she was threatened with prosecution herself. The system had become so invested in its own narrative that truth became secondary to maintaining the illusion of justice. Meanwhile, those who steadfastly maintained their innocence faced almost certain death. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother known throughout the community for her piety and kindness, refused to confess to crimes she never committed. Her moral courage in the face of certain execution stands as one of the most powerful examples of integrity during this dark period. When given one final chance to confess and save her life, she replied that she could not belie her own soul. The execution process itself was deliberately public and traumatic. Hangings took place on Gallows Hill, with crowds gathering to witness what they believed was divine justice being served. But many in these crowds began to have doubts as they watched respected community members die, protesting their innocence with their final breaths. The accused were transported to the execution site in carts, often accompanied by ministers, urging them to confess even at this final moment. Some maintained their innocence to the end, while others, broken by months of imprisonment and torture, gave false confessions hoping for mercy that never came. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves, denied proper Christian burial, adding another layer of cruelty to families already devastated by loss. As the death toll mounted, cracks began to appear in the community's support for the trials. Some of the most influential families in Salem found themselves touched by accusations. When Lady Mary Phipps, wife of the governor, was accused of witchcraft, it became clear that no one was safe from the hysteria. The arbitrary nature of the accusations became impossible to ignore when they reached the highest levels of colonial society. Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most respected religious leaders in Massachusetts, began expressing doubts about spectral evidence. In a sermon delivered in October 1692, he declared that it was better for 10 suspected witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned. This represented a dramatic shift in religious authority away from supporting the trials. The economic impact of the trials was devastating the community. Farms lay untended as families fled or found themselves in prison. Commerce ground to a halt as suspicion poisoned business relationships. The costs of maintaining the court, housing prisoners, and conducting trials drained public resources. Salem was literally destroying itself in pursuit of imaginary enemies. Even some of the afflicted girls began showing signs of doubt and exhaustion. Maintaining their performances required constant energy and creativity. Some started contradicting their earlier testimony or failing to identify accused witches they had previously claimed to recognize instantly. The cracks in their stories became more apparent as the months wore on. The role of gender in the trials became increasingly evident as the hysteria progressed. The vast majority of the accused were women, particularly those who defied conventional social expectations. Bridget Bishop, the first to be executed, was known for her colorful clothing and independent spirit. Sarah Good was a beggar who made people uncomfortable with her aggressive requests for charity. These women were easy targets because they already existed on the margins of acceptable society. But the trials also revealed the power that young women could wield in a society that typically rendered them voiceless. The afflicted girls found themselves at the center of attention, their words carrying life and death weight. For perhaps the first time in their lives, adults hung on their every utterance. This taste of power proved intoxicating for some, while others were clearly terrified by the forces they had unleashed. The international implications of the Salem witch trials were significant. News of the proceedings spread throughout the American colonies and back to Europe, where many viewed the events as evidence of colonial barbarism. Educated Europeans had largely moved beyond widespread witch persecution, making Salem appear backward and primitive. This damaged the reputation of Massachusetts, just as it was trying to establish itself as a serious and civilized colony. Religious leaders outside of Salem watched the proceedings with growing alarm. The trials represented an extreme interpretation of Puritan theology that many found disturbing. The emphasis on spectral evidence and supernatural phenomena contradicted more rational approaches to faith that were gaining ground in other communities. The legal precedents being established were equally troubling to observers trained in English common law. The admission of spectral evidence, the presumption of guilt, and the pressure to confess violated fundamental principles of justice. Lawyers and judges in other colonies worried that such proceedings could spread, undermining the entire colonial legal system. As autumn arrived in 1692, the weight of doubt and opposition finally began to influence those in power. Governor Phipps, faced with criticism from religious leaders, legal experts, and even his own wife's accusations, began to question the proceedings he had authorized. The court that had seemed so confident in its divine mission was increasingly isolated and defensive. The final executions took place in September 1692, but by then, the momentum was clearly shifting against the trials. Public opinion was turning, influential voices were speaking out, and the practical costs of continuing the hysteria were becoming unbearable. The witch hunt that had consumed Salem for months was finally beginning to exhaust itself. But the damage was done. 20 people were dead, hundreds had been imprisoned, and the community was shattered beyond easy repair. Families were torn apart by accusations and counter-accusations. Economic relationships were destroyed by suspicion. The social fabric that held the community together had been ripped to shreds by months of fear and paranoia. The children who lived through this experience carried the trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed their parents, neighbors, and friends accused, imprisoned, and in some cases executed for crimes that existed only in imagination. They had seen their community abandon reason and justice in favor of fear and superstition. These lessons about the fragility of civilization and the danger of mass hysteria would shape their worldview forever. As winter approached, Salem faced the enormous task of rebuilding not just its institutions, but its soul. The witch trials had revealed the darkest aspects of human nature under pressure. They had shown how quickly a community could turn against itself when fear overcame reason. The aftermath would prove almost as challenging as the trials themselves, as Salem struggled to come to terms with what it had done to itself in the name of protecting itself from evil. As the sun began to set on what many would later describe as the darkest chapter in colonial American history, the people of Salem faced a terrifying realization. The very fabric of their society had been torn apart, not by external enemies or natural disasters, but by their own fears and suspicions turned monstrous. The witch trials of 1692 had ended, but their devastating consequences would echo through generations, leaving scars that would never fully heal. The immediate aftermath of the trials revealed the true scope of the catastrophe. 20 innocent people lay dead, executed based on spectral evidence and community hysteria. Over 150 individuals had been imprisoned under horrific conditions, many for months on end. Families soon had been destroyed, fortunes lost, and reputations ruined beyond repair. The social bonds that had once held the Puritan community together had been severed, replaced by lingering mistrust and paranoia that would persist for decades. For those who survived the ordeal, life after the trials proved almost as challenging as the trials themselves. Former prisoners emerged from jail broken in body and spirit, many suffering from what we would now recognize as severe trauma. They had endured months of physical deprivation, psychological torture, and the constant threat of execution. Some had been forced to confess to crimes they never committed, living with the shame and guilt of having saved their own lives through false testimony that may have condemned others. The financial devastation was equally severe. Accused individuals had been required to pay for their own imprisonment, including the costs of food, lodging, and even the chains that bound them. These fees accumulated daily, creating crushing debts that many families could never hope to repay. Property had been seized to cover court costs and sheriff's fees, leaving entire families destitute. Some who had once been prosperous members of the community found themselves reduced to begging for basic necessities. Perhaps most tragically, many of the surviving accused discovered that their legal ordeals were far from over. Although the special court that had conducted the witch trials was dissolved in October 1692, numerous individuals remained under suspicion or faced ongoing legal challenges. Some had been convicted but not yet executed when the trials ended, leaving their legal status in limbo for months or even years. Others found themselves unable to reclaim property that had been confiscated, trapped in legal battles that could drag on indefinitely. The psychological impact on the broader community was equally profound. Neighbors who had once trusted each other now viewed every interaction through the lens of potential betrayal. Children had watched their parents arrested and possibly executed. Parents had seen their children accused of consorting with the devil. The fundamental assumptions about justice, community, and divine providence that had anchored Puritan society had been shattered beyond repair. The clergy, who had played such a central role in promoting and sustaining the witch hunt, found themselves facing a crisis of authority and credibility. Reverend Samuel Parris, in whose household the initial accusations had originated, became increasingly isolated within his own congregation. Many parishioners refused to attend services while he remained their minister, viewing him as directly responsible for the tragedy that had befallen their community. His sermons, once regarded as authoritative interpretations of divine will, were now met with skepticism and resentment. Other ministers who had enthusiastically supported the trials faced similar challenges to their authority. Cotton Mather, despite his attempts to distance himself from the more extreme aspects of the proceedings, found his reputation permanently tarnished by his association with the witch hunt. The intellectual and spiritual leadership that the clergy had provided to Puritan society had been compromised, creating a vacuum that would contribute to the gradual secularization of colonial culture in the decades that followed. The legal system itself required fundamental reconstruction in the wake of the trials. The use of spectral evidence, which had been central to most convictions, was widely discredited and eventually banned from Massachusetts courts. The concept that dreams, visions, and supernatural apparitions could serve as valid testimony in criminal proceedings was abandoned, forcing colonial courts to develop more rigorous standards of evidence and procedure. This legal evolution represented one of the few positive outcomes of the Salem tragedy. The recognition that the court system had failed so catastrophically led to important reforms in colonial jurisprudence. The presumption of innocence, the right to adequate legal representation, and the requirement for multiple credible witnesses became more firmly established principles. These changes would eventually influence the development of American legal traditions, contributing to the constitutional protections that would be enshrined in the Bill of Rights nearly a century later. However, these legal reforms came too late for the victims of 1692. The families of those who had been executed struggled not only with their grief, but also with the social stigma attached to their loved ones' deaths. In Puritan society, execution for witchcraft carried implications beyond the immediate loss of life. It suggested that the condemned had been in league with Satan, calling into question their eternal salvation and casting doubt on the spiritual standing of their entire family line. Many family members found themselves ostracized by their communities, unable to find employment, marriage partners, or social acceptance. Some chose to leave Salem entirely, seeking fresh starts in distant communities where their family histories were unknown. Others remained, but lived under a cloud of suspicion that followed them for the rest of their lives. The children of executed victims faced particular challenges, growing up with the knowledge that their parents had been branded as servants of evil by their own community. The economic consequences of the trials extended far beyond the immediate costs of imprisonment and legal proceedings. Salem's reputation as a center of commerce and trade suffered severe damage, as merchants and ship captains became reluctant to conduct business in a community that had been so thoroughly associated with supernatural evil. The port, which had been a vital economic engine for the region, experienced a significant decline in activity that took years to recover. Agricultural production also suffered as farmers who had been imprisoned or executed could not tend their crops during crucial growing seasons. Land that had been carefully cultivated for generations sometimes lay fallow, leading to food shortages and economic hardship throughout the region. The disruption of normal economic activities compounded the financial devastation caused by the direct costs of the trials themselves. The international reputation of Massachusetts, and indeed all of New England, suffered tremendously as news of the witch trials spread throughout the Atlantic world. European observers, already skeptical of colonial society, pointed to Salem as evidence of the barbarism and superstition that characterized life in the New World. This damaged reputation made it more difficult for the colonies to attract new immigrants and investment, slowing economic development for years after the trials ended. Religious communities throughout Europe and America watched the Salem events with a mixture of horror and fascination. Many began to question the wisdom of allowing religious authorities to exercise such extensive influence over civil government. The spectacle of learned ministers endorsing executions based on spectral evidence discredited not only the individuals involved, but also the broader principle of theocratic governance that had been central to Puritan political theory. As the immediate crisis passed and the community began the long process of healing, several individuals emerged to acknowledge their roles in the tragedy and seek some form of reconciliation. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who had presided over the trials, became perhaps the most prominent figure to publicly repent for his actions. In January of 1697, he stood before his congregation while a statement of remorse was read aloud, accepting blame and shame for his role in the executions. Sewall's public confession was remarkable for its time, as it represented an extraordinary admission of error by a figure of substantial authority and prestige. His willingness to accept responsibility helped begin a process of community healing, though it could never restore the lives that had been lost or undo the suffering that had been inflicted. Other officials and community members gradually followed his example, though many never acknowledged their own contributions to the hysteria. Ann Putnam Jr., who had been one of the primary accusers during the trials, eventually offered her own public apology. In 1706, she requested that a statement be read before the Salem village congregation in which she acknowledged that she had been deluded by Satan and had contributed to the deaths of innocent people. Her apology, while significant, came only after years of social isolation and community pressure, and many questioned its sincerity. The families of the victims worked tirelessly to clear the names of their executed relatives and secure some form of official acknowledgement of the injustice that had been done. This process proved frustratingly slow and incomplete. While some convictions were eventually reversed and some compensation provided to survivors, the legal and bureaucratic machinery of colonial government was ill-equipped to address the magnitude of the wrong that had been committed. In 1711, the Massachusetts General Court finally passed legislation that reversed the convictions of many of the accused and provided financial compensation to their families. However, this restoration came nearly 20 years as after the trials and provided only partial relief to those who had suffered. The compensation was often inadequate to address the full extent of the financial losses that families had endured, and no amount of money could restore the lives that had been lost or the reputations that had been destroyed. The process of commemoration and remembrance proved equally complex and contested. Different members of the community had vastly different perspectives on how the events of 1692 should be remembered and what lessons should be drawn from them. Some preferred to minimize discussion of the trials altogether, viewing them as an embarrassing episode that was best forgotten. Others insisted on the importance of preserving the memory of what had happened as a warning against future injustices. The physical landscape of Salem itself bore witness to the tragedy. The hill where the executions had taken place became a site of both pilgrimage and avoidance, depending on one's perspective. Some community members avoided the area entirely, viewing it as cursed or haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. Others visited regularly to pay their respects to the victims and reflect on the lessons of the trials. The Salem Village Meeting House, where many of the initial accusations had been made, and where the community had gathered to discuss the supernatural crisis, became a contested space. Some members of the congregation felt that the building itself had been corrupted by the events that had taken place within its walls and advocated for its demolition or replacement. Others argued that the structure should be preserved as a reminder of both the community's failures and its capacity for redemption. As the 18th century progressed, the Salem witch trials increasingly came to be viewed as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism, mass hysteria, and the abuse of governmental power. Enlightenment thinkers throughout America and Europe pointed to Salem as an example of what could happen when reason was abandoned in favor of superstition and when proper legal safeguards were ignored in the pursuit of social control. The trials also contributed to a broader transformation in American religious culture. The absolute authority that Puritan ministers had once exercised over their congregations began to erode as communities became more skeptical of claims to divine revelation and supernatural knowledge. The Great Awakening of the 1740s while still deeply religious in character, emphasized personal spiritual experience over clerical authority in ways that reflected the lasting impact of the Salem crisis. Educational institutions throughout the colonies began to incorporate the study of logic, natural philosophy, and empirical observation into their curricula, partly as a response to the intellectual failures that had been demonstrated at Salem. The trials served as a powerful argument for the importance of critical thinking and scientific method in evaluating claims about the natural world and human behavior. The legal precedents established in the aftermath of the trials continued to influence American jurisprudence well into the Revolutionary period and beyond. The rejection of spectral evidence and the emphasis on multiple credible witnesses became standard features of colonial courts. The principle that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, while not always perfectly applied, became more firmly established in legal practice. Perhaps most significantly, the Salem witch trials contributed to a growing skepticism about the dangers of concentrating too much power in the hands of any single institution or group of individuals. The spectacle of ministers, magistrates, and community leaders, all contributing to a process that resulted in the execution of innocent people, provided a powerful argument for the importance of checks and balances in governmental systems. This skepticism would eventually contribute to the revolutionary ideology that emerged in the decades leading up to American independence. The colonists' resistance to British authority was informed in part by their understanding, derived from experiences like Salem, of how quickly governmental power could be abused when it was not subject to adequate oversight and constraint. The victims of the Salem witch trials, in their suffering and death, had inadvertently contributed to the development of principles that would become central to American democracy. Their sacrifice, though unintended and unjust, helped establish the importance of individual rights, due process, and the limitation of governmental power that would be enshrined in the Constitution and Bill of Rights. As night fell over Salem for countless evenings after 1692, the community remained forever changed by the events of that terrible year. The darkness that had descended upon the town during the witch trials had been lifted, but its shadows continued to shape the community's understanding of justice, authority, and human nature. The people of Salem had learned, at an enormous cost, that the greatest threats to a community often came not from external enemies or supernatural forces, but from the fears and prejudices that could turn neighbors against each other with devastating consequences. The witch trials of 1692 stand as one of the most important cautionary tales in American history, demonstrating how quickly a civilized society could descend into chaos when reason was abandoned in favor of fear, when justice was sacrificed to expedience, and when the basic rights of individuals were ignored in the name of community safety. The lessons learned in Salem, written in the blood of innocent victims, would echo through American history as a constant reminder of the vigilance required to preserve freedom and justice in any society. Looking at the Salem witch trials, their immediate aftermath was devastating. Families were torn apart, communities were shattered, lives were lost. But what happened next tells us something crucial about human nature and how societies can begin to heal from their darkest moments. In the months following the last executions of 1692, a profound shift began to take hold. The fever of accusation that had gripped Salem started to break, like a terrible illness finally running its course. People began to wake up from what seemed like a collective nightmare, and what they saw horrified them. The first cracks in the foundation of the witch trials appeared when prominent citizens found themselves accused. When the wife of Governor William Phipps was named as a witch, suddenly the whole enterprise looked different to those in power. When accusations reached the upper echelons of Massachusetts society, including ministers and wealthy merchants, the credibility of the entire process crumbled. But it wasn't just political pressure that ended the trials. A growing number of people began to question the very methods being used. How could spectral evidence, these ghostly visions that only accusers could see, be trusted in a court of law? How could invisible, unprovable claims determine life and death? The questions that should have been asked from the beginning finally found their voice. Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most respected religious leaders in New England, published a treatise called Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits. In it, he argued that it was better for 10 suspected witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned. This was revolutionary thinking for the time. Mather's influence helped turn the tide of public opinion against the trials. The new Superior Court of Judicature, established in early 1693, took a dramatically different approach. They rejected spectral evidence entirely. Of the 52 people brought before this new court, only 3 were convicted, and even those convictions were later overturned by Governor Phipps. The remaining accused were either acquitted or had charges dropped entirely. But the end of the trials was just the beginning of a long, painful process of reckoning. Salem had to confront what it had done to itself. The community was left to grapple with an impossible question. How do you rebuild trust when neighbors have accused neighbors, when families have turned against each other, when the very foundations of justice have been corrupted? The first step was acknowledgement. In 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and prayer to atone for the tragedy of the witch trials. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who had presided over the trials, publicly confessed his guilt and shame. Standing in the Old South Church in Boston, he had his confession read aloud, taking blame and asking for forgiveness for his role in the deaths of innocent people. Sewall's confession was remarkable for its time. Public officials rarely admitted error, especially not in matters of life and death. But Sewall understood that healing required honesty. His confession read, in part, Samuel Sewall, sensible of the reiterated strokes of God upon himself and family, and being sensible that as to the guilt contracted upon the opening of the late commission of Oyer and Terminer at Salem, he is, upon many accounts, more concerned than any that he knows of, desires to take the blame and shame of it. The jury members who had convicted the accused also issued a public statement of regret. They acknowledged that they had been sadly deluded and mistaken, and asked forgiveness from God and from the families of those they had wrongly condemned. These admissions were extraordinary. They represented a community trying to face the truth about itself, no matter how painful. But acknowledgement was easier than restitution. How do you compensate a family for a father hanged as a wizard? How do you restore the reputation of a woman crushed to death for refusing to enter a plea? How do you give back years of life to those who rotted in prison cells? The colony tried. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill reversing the attainders of many of those convicted and executed. They declared that the trials had been conducted without sufficient grounds and that the convictions were null and void. Financial compensation was provided to the families of victims, though the amounts were often inadequate and the process was slow and bureaucratic. Some families received substantial settlements. The estate of Rebecca Nurse was awarded £578 and 12 shillings, a significant sum for the time. Others received much less or nothing at all. The process was inconsistent and often depended on the political connections and persistence of surviving family members. But beyond the legal and financial responses, Salem faced a deeper challenge. How do you rebuild a community's soul? The trials had revealed something terrifying about human nature. They had shown how quickly reason could give way to hysteria, how easily fear could overcome justice, how readily people could turn against their neighbors when gripped by panic. The psychological scars ran deep. Children who had grown up during the trials carried the trauma into adulthood. Families remained divided for generations. Some of the accusers, particularly the young women whose fits had started the whole crisis, lived the rest of their lives under a cloud of suspicion and regret. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the primary accusers, eventually issued a public apology. In 1706, at the age of 26, she stood before the Salem village congregation and confessed that she had been deluded by Satan and had brought great guilt and sin upon herself and others. She asked forgiveness from the families of those she had accused, acknowledging the great wrong she had done. Her apology was remarkable, but it came too late for those who had died, and it raised troubling questions that Salem struggled to answer. If Ann Putnam had been deceived by Satan, what did that say about the other accusers? What did it say about the ministers and judges who had believed her? What did it say about a community that had been so eager to believe in supernatural evil that it had destroyed its own members? The witch trials also forced Salem to confront uncomfortable truths about social divisions within the community. Many historians have noted that the accusations often followed lines of existing conflict. The accusers tended to come from Salem village, while many of the accused came from Salem town. The accusers were often from families of lower social standing, while the accused included many prosperous farmers and merchants. This pattern suggested that the witch trials had been, at least in part, a way for long-standing grievances to explode into deadly violence. Economic tensions, property disputes, religious disagreements, and social resentments had found expression through accusations of witchcraft. The trials had given people a way to destroy their enemies while claiming to serve God and community. Recognizing this pattern was crucial for Salem's recovery. It meant acknowledging that the witch trials hadn't been just a supernatural crisis or a moment of temporary madness. They had been rooted in real, ongoing problems within the community. Healing would require addressing these underlying tensions, not just the symptoms they had produced. The religious community faced its own reckoning. The Puritan ministers who had supported and encouraged the trials found their authority severely undermined. Cotton Mather, who had been one of the most vocal supporters of the proceedings, spent years trying to defend his actions. His reputation never fully recovered, and his influence waned as Salem turned away from the kind of religious extremism that had fueled the crisis. New voices emerged in the religious community, ministers who preached tolerance, careful reasoning, and skepticism of supernatural claims. They emphasized that God's justice was perfect, but human justice was fallible. They warned against the dangers of religious enthusiasm that bypassed reason and evidence. The witch trials also had broader implications for American legal development. The rejection of spectral evidence marked an important step toward more rigorous standards of proof in criminal cases. The emphasis on protecting the innocent, even at the risk of letting the guilty escape, would become a fundamental principle of American jurisprudence. Legal scholars began to write about the importance of due process, the rights of the accused, and the dangers of allowing fear and emotion to override careful legal procedure. The Salem trials became a cautionary tale studied by lawyers and judges, a reminder of what could happen when legal systems abandoned their commitment to evidence and reason. But perhaps the most important legacy of Salem's recovery was its demonstration that communities could learn from their mistakes. Salem showed that societies could acknowledge error, make amends, and rebuild on stronger foundations. The process was slow, painful, and incomplete, but it was real. The recovery wasn't perfect. Some families never reconciled. Some reputations were never fully restored. Some lessons took generations to fully learn. But Salem emerged from the crisis with a deeper understanding of human nature and the fragility of justice. The community developed a wariness of mass hysteria and an appreciation for the importance of protecting individual rights against collective panic. This hard-won wisdom would prove valuable in the decades and centuries that followed. When other communities faced their own moments of crisis and panic, Salem's example served as both warning and guide. The witch trials became a touchstone for discussions about justice, community, and the dangers of unchecked fear. The story of Salem's recovery is ultimately a story about redemption, not the magical kind that the accused had been denied, but the human kind that comes through acknowledgement, repentance, and the patient work of rebuilding trust. It's a story about how communities can face their darkest moments and emerge with greater wisdom and stronger commitments to justice. Salem learned that the greatest protection against future witch hunts wasn't stronger laws or better procedures, though those helped. It was the cultivation of humility, the recognition that human judgment is fallible, and the commitment to protecting the vulnerable even when the crowd demands blood. These lessons, paid for with innocent lives, became part of Salem's legacy and America's founding principles. The town that had nearly destroyed itself through fear and suspicion slowly rebuilt itself on foundations of tolerance and careful reasoning. It was a transformation that would echo through American history, influencing everything from constitutional protections to civil rights movements. Salem's recovery showed that even the darkest chapters in human history could teach valuable lessons if communities had the courage to face the truth about themselves and the wisdom to build something better from the ashes of their mistakes. For someone accused of witchcraft in Salem, the nightmare was just beginning once the accusations were made. But what happened after the trials ended? How did the survivors rebuild their lives? And what became of the accusers who had torn their community apart? The immediate aftermath of the Salem witch trials was a community in ruins. Families had been destroyed, neighbors had turned against each other, and the very fabric of society seemed irreparably torn. Those who had survived imprisonment faced the devastating task of returning to a world that had fundamentally changed. Many found their property confiscated, their livestock dead, and their homes in ruins. The families of the executed faced not only grief, but also the practical challenges of survival without their primary breadwinners. The financial devastation was staggering. The accused had been required to pay for their own imprisonment, including the cost of their chains, food, and even the straw they slept on. These fees accumulated over months of incarceration, and many families emerged from the crisis deeply in debt. Some lost their farms and businesses entirely, forced to start over with nothing. The economic disruption rippled through the entire community, as trade relationships and credit networks had been shattered by the accusations and counter-accusations. For those who had been imprisoned but survived, the psychological scars ran deep. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had witnessed friends and family members led to their deaths, had endured months of brutal conditions, and had lived with the constant fear that they would be next. Sleep was often elusive, filled with nightmares and memories of the dank, overcrowded cells where they had been held. The social fabric of Salem had been irreversibly altered. Former friends could no longer look each other in the eye, knowing that one had accused the other of consorting with the devil. Children who had been the primary witnesses in many cases found themselves ostracized as they grew older, and people began to question the validity of their testimonies. The community struggled with questions of forgiveness and reconciliation that would persist for generations. Perhaps most challenging was the question of how to move forward when so many had participated in the madness. The accusers, the judges, the jury members, the spectators who had cheered at the executions, all had blood on their hands. Some, like Judge Samuel Sewall, publicly confessed their errors and sought forgiveness. In 1697, Sewall stood in his church while his confession was read aloud, acknowledging his role in the wrongful executions and asking for God's forgiveness. The young women who had been the primary accusers faced a more complex reckoning. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most prolific accusers, eventually made a public confession in 1706, stating that she had been deluded by Satan and expressing sorrow for her role in the deaths of innocent people. However, her confession was carefully worded to suggest that she had been as much a victim as those she had accused, claiming she had been deceived rather than deliberately malicious. Other accusers were less forthcoming. Some left Salem entirely, seeking fresh starts in communities where their reputations hadn't been tainted by their participation in the trials. Others maintained their silence, never acknowledging their role in the tragedy. The community was left to grapple with how to treat these individuals. Were they also victims of the mass hysteria, or were they culpable for the deaths they had caused? The legal system itself underwent significant changes in response to the Salem trials. The use of spectral evidence, testimony about dreams and visions, was formally rejected by the courts. New safeguards were put in place to prevent the kind of rushed proceedings that had characterized the witch trials. The burden of proof was raised, and the rights of the accused were strengthened. These changes helped ensure that nothing like Salem could happen again in the Massachusetts legal system. Religious leaders also engaged in serious soul-searching. Many had supported the trials initially, believing they were fighting a real supernatural threat. The realization that they had been complicit in the deaths of innocent people led to significant theological reflection. Some ministers, like Cotton Mather, continued to defend the trials while acknowledging that mistakes had been made. Others, like his father, Increase Mather, became more vocal critics of the proceedings they had once supported. The victims' families faced the painful process of clearing their loved ones' names. This was not merely a symbolic gesture, but had practical implications for inheritance rights and family honor. In 1711, the Massachusetts General Court passed legislation reversing the attainder of many of the accused, restoring their civil rights posthumously. Monetary compensation was also provided to many families, though it could never truly compensate for their losses. The process of healing was slow and incomplete. Some families never recovered from the trauma and scandal. Others found ways to rebuild and move forward, though the memories of 1692 cast long shadows over their lives. Intermarriage between families that had been on opposite sides of the accusations was rare, and social divisions persisted for decades. The children who had grown up during the trials carried their own burdens into adulthood. Many had lost parents, siblings, or other relatives. They had witnessed events that no child should see and had lived through a period when the very foundations of their world seemed to crumble. Some became advocates for tolerance and due process, their experiences having taught them the dangers of mob mentality and unchecked accusations. The economic recovery of Salem was gradual. The port city's advantageous location and established trade networks helped it bounce back. But it took years to fully restore the commercial relationships that had been damaged during the crisis. Some businesses never recovered, and certain families never regained their former prosperity. The trials had disrupted not just individual lives, but the entire economic ecosystem of the community. One of the most lasting impacts was on the relationship between civil and religious authority. The trials had shown the dangers of allowing religious fervor to override legal protections and rational deliberation. This experience contributed to a growing separation between church and state in Massachusetts, a development that would later influence the broader American approach to religious freedom and civil liberties. The memory of Salem became a cautionary tale that extended far beyond Massachusetts. As news of the trials and their aftermath spread, other communities became more skeptical of witchcraft accusations. The Salem experience helped bring the witch trial era to a close in America, as people recognized the dangers of mass hysteria and the importance of maintaining rational legal processes even in times of crisis. For the survivors, daily life meant learning to navigate a world where trust had been shattered. Simple interactions carried new weight. A neighbor's sideways glance, a child's strange behavior, and unexplained illness could all trigger memories of the accusations and fears. The community had to develop new social norms and ways of resolving conflicts that didn't rely on supernatural explanations or encourage the kind of finger-pointing that had proved so destructive. The trials also had unexpected consequences for women's roles in society. The fact that women had been both the primary accusers and the primary victims led to complex discussions about female authority and credibility. Some argued that women's emotional nature made them unreliable witnesses, while others pointed out that women had been scapegoated for broader social problems. These debates would influence discussions about women's rights and roles for generations to come. Perhaps most importantly, Salem forced the community to confront the limitations of human knowledge and the dangers of absolute certainty. The trials had been driven by people who were absolutely convinced they were fighting evil and protecting their community. The realization that such certainty could lead to such terrible consequences fostered a new appreciation for humility, tolerance, and the importance of maintaining doubt, even in the face of seemingly overwhelming evidence. The legacy of Salem extended beyond the immediate community to influence American legal and cultural development. The experience contributed to stronger protections for the accused, more rigorous standards of evidence, and a healthy skepticism toward claims of supernatural intervention in human affairs. It also provided a powerful metaphor for the dangers of mass hysteria and the persecution of unpopular minorities, one that would be invoked repeatedly throughout American history. As the years passed, Salem gradually transformed from a community defined by tragedy to one that had learned valuable lessons about human nature, justice, and the importance of protecting individual rights even in times of crisis. The scars never fully healed, but they served as permanent reminders of what could happen when fear overcame reason and when communities allowed themselves to be driven by suspicion rather than evidence. The story of Salem's recovery is ultimately a story about resilience and the human capacity to learn from even the most terrible mistakes. It shows how communities can rebuild after devastating conflicts and how individuals can find ways to move forward despite carrying the weight of traumatic memories. Most importantly, it demonstrates that from the darkest chapters of human experience can come the most important lessons about justice, tolerance, and the precious nature of the rights we too often take for granted. The witch trials of Salem may have ended in 1692, but their impact rippled through generations, fundamentally altering the trajectory of not just Salem, but the entire colonial understanding of justice, authority, and human nature. The immediate aftermath was devastating. Families were shattered, communities lay in ruins, and the very foundations of Puritan society had been shaken to their core. In the months following the last executions, a profound silence settled over Salem. The hysteria that had consumed the town for nearly a year simply evaporated, leaving behind a landscape of devastation that would take decades to fully comprehend. 20 people had lost their lives. Hundreds more had been imprisoned, tortured, and traumatized. The economic cost was staggering, with families bankrupted by legal fees, lost property, and the inability to work while imprisoned or fleeing accusations. But perhaps the most significant casualty was trust itself. Neighbors who had once shared meals and worship now eyed each other with suspicion. Children had watched their parents dragged away in chains. Husbands had seen wives hanged on Gallows Hill. The social fabric that had held these Puritan communities together for generations had been torn apart by the very mechanisms meant to protect it. The psychological wounds ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. Many of those who survived imprisonment never fully recovered from the trauma. They suffered what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of interrogation, torture, and the constant threat of death. Some withdrew from community life entirely, unable to trust their neighbors or participate in the religious and social activities that had once defined their existence. For the accusers, particularly the young girls whose visions had sparked the entire crisis, the aftermath brought its own form of torment. As the community slowly recognized the magnitude of the injustice that had occurred, these girls found themselves transformed from victims to villains in the public consciousness. Some, like Ann Putnam Jr., would later publicly apologize for their role in the trials, acknowledging that they had been deluded and expressing deep remorse for the suffering they had caused. The religious implications were equally profound. The Puritan belief system that had justified and sustained the trials came under intense scrutiny. How could a godly community have gone so far astray? How could ministers and magistrates, supposedly guided by divine wisdom, have participated in such obvious injustice? These questions struck at the very heart of Puritan theology and authority. Reverend John Hale, who had initially supported the trials, underwent a dramatic transformation in his thinking. He published a work titled A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft, in which he acknowledged his errors and called for more careful consideration of evidence in such cases. His public admission of fault was remarkable for a Puritan minister and reflected the broader crisis of confidence that swept through the religious establishment. The legal system faced an equally devastating reckoning. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved, and the remaining cases were transferred to regular courts, which acquitted nearly all the remaining defendants. The use of spectral evidence was formally rejected, and new legal procedures were implemented to prevent similar miscarriages of justice. But the damage to the colonial legal system's credibility was severe. The trials had demonstrated how quickly legal protections could be abandoned in the face of public hysteria, and how easily the machinery of justice could be turned into an instrument of oppression. This lesson would profoundly influence the development of American legal principles, contributing to the emphasis on due process, the presumption of innocence, and the protection of individual rights that would later be enshrined in the Constitution. The economic consequences extended far beyond Salem itself. The trials had disrupted trade, destroyed property values, and created a climate of uncertainty that affected the entire region. Many families lost their life savings to legal fees and property confiscations. The reputations of accused individuals, even those who were eventually acquitted, remained tainted for years, affecting their ability to conduct business or maintain their social standing. The Massachusetts colonial government eventually recognized the need for formal redress. In 1711, the General Court passed an act reversing the attainders of those who had been executed and providing financial compensation to their families. The amounts were modest compared to what had been lost, but the gesture represented an important acknowledgement of governmental responsibility for the injustice. Individual acts of repentance also played a crucial role in the healing process. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who had presided over the trials, publicly confessed his error and asked for forgiveness. On a designated day of fasting and prayer, he stood before his congregation while his minister read aloud his statement of remorse. This public act of contrition was unprecedented for a colonial official and demonstrated the profound impact the trials had on those who participated in them. The trials also had lasting effects on gender relations in colonial society. The fact that the accusers were primarily young women and that many of the accused were older women, highlighted the complex dynamics of power, age, and gender in Puritan communities. Some historians argue that the trials represented a backlash against women who had gained too much independence or influence, while others see them as reflecting deeper anxieties about female sexuality and spiritual authority. The aftermath also revealed the extent to which social and economic tensions had contributed to the crisis. Many of the accusation patterns followed lines of property disputes, family feuds, and community rivalries that had nothing to do with witchcraft. This recognition led to a more sophisticated understanding of how social pressures could manifest in apparently religious or supernatural forms. Perhaps most significantly, the Salem witch trials marked the beginning of the end of witchcraft prosecutions in the English-speaking world. While isolated cases would continue to occur, the scale and intensity of what happened in Salem so thoroughly discredited the entire enterprise that it became increasingly difficult to sustain belief in the reality of witchcraft as a prosecutable crime. The intellectual climate was also shifting. The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment were introducing new ways of understanding the natural world that left less room for supernatural explanations. Educated colonists were increasingly influenced by rational, empirical approaches to knowledge that made witchcraft beliefs seem primitive and superstitious. This transformation was not immediate or complete. Many colonists continued to believe in the reality of witchcraft, even as they rejected the methods used to prosecute it. The distinction between believing in supernatural forces and believing that human institutions could reliably identify and punish them became increasingly important in colonial thought. The trials also influenced the development of American religious pluralism. The obvious injustices committed in the name of religious orthodoxy contributed to growing skepticism about the dangers of established churches and religious conformity. This skepticism would eventually contribute to the principle of religious freedom that would be enshrined in the First Amendment. The memory of Salem became a powerful cautionary tale that would be invoked repeatedly throughout American history whenever concerns arose about mass hysteria, persecution of minorities, or the abuse of governmental power. During the McCarthy era of the 1950s, playwright Arthur Miller would write The Crucible, using the Salem trials as an allegory for the anti-communist witch hunts of his own time. The parallels were striking. The same patterns of accusation, confession, and denunciation, the same willingness to destroy lives based on suspicion rather than evidence, the same tendency for fear to overwhelm reason and justice. Miller's play demonstrated how the lessons of Salem remained relevant centuries later, serving as a warning about the fragility of civil liberties and the ease with which democratic societies could slide into authoritarianism. The transformation of Salem itself reflects the broader changes that occurred in the aftermath of the trials. The town gradually rebuilt its reputation and economy, but it could never entirely escape the shadow of 1692. Over time, Salem learned to embrace its dark history, eventually becoming a center for tourism and historical education about the dangers of intolerance and injustice. The witch trials also contributed to important developments in legal theory and practice. The emphasis on more rigorous standards of evidence, the rejection of spectral testimony, and the insistence on proper legal procedures all became part of the colonial legal tradition that would influence the development of American jurisprudence. The concept of individual rights, which had been so flagrantly violated during the trials, gained new prominence in colonial thinking. The idea that individuals possessed certain fundamental rights that could not be violated, even in the name of community safety or religious orthodoxy, became increasingly important in American political thought. The trials also highlighted the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of institutional safeguards against abuse of power. The speed with which normal legal protections had been abandoned and the ease with which respected officials had participated in obvious injustice demonstrated the need for more robust checks and balances in governmental systems. These lessons would prove invaluable during the founding of the American Republic. The framers of the Constitution were acutely aware of how quickly liberty could be lost and how important it was to create institutional structures that could resist the pressures of temporary hysteria or factional passion. The Salem witch trials thus represent far more than an isolated episode of colonial superstition. They were a transformative moment that helped shape fundamental American values and institutions. The recognition that even well-intentioned people could participate in terrible injustices, that communities could be swept up in destructive hysteria, and that legal and religious institutions could fail in their most basic responsibilities became part of the American political consciousness. The legacy of Salem continues to resonate today, reminding us that the struggle for justice and human dignity is never finished, that vigilance against intolerance and abuse of power must be constant, and that the price of freedom is indeed eternal watchfulness. The 20 lives lost on Gallows Hill were not sacrificed in vain if their memory continues to inspire us to build more just and humane societies. Today, as we close this journey through one of America's darkest chapters, we're reminded that Salem's true legacy isn't found in sensationalized tales of witchcraft, but in the hard-won wisdom born from tragedy. The lessons etched into history by those 20 lives lost, those 150 imprisoned, and those countless families torn apart continue to resonate 3 centuries later. Their suffering wasn't in vain if we remember what it taught us about the fragility of justice, the danger of unchecked fear, and the courage required to admit our mistakes. Salem became America's first great reckoning with its own capacity for injustice, forcing a young nation to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the price of mass hysteria. The reforms that followed, the protections we built, the skepticism we learned to embrace, all flow from that terrible winter when reason abandoned a community consumed by fear. Perhaps most importantly, Salem reminds us that the fight for justice isn't one once and forgotten, but must be renewed by each generation willing to stand against the darkness of their own time.